No, we live in plutocratic oligarchies, with an elite that governs mainly according to its own interests, while claiming that our societies are secular and freed from the old gods, when in reality, we have created new cults for ourselves. We venerate economic activity, we place banknotes at the top of our values. This is what constitutes the sacred of the modern era. Technological development leads to the disappearance of a part of humanity. With artificial intelligence, many activities that we once considered deeply human are now carried out by machines, making some human functions less and less necessary. And a problem arises. What should be done with people whose skills are no longer useful in today's world? Could green business be one of the greatest illusions of the 21st century? The concept of green business or green growth actually has no concrete basis. The number of burnouts and cases of depression constitutes a real crisis. How many people wake up every morning eagerly waiting for the end of the day? It is still very worrying. What is it in our society that isn't working and is leading us in a dangerous direction? We have noticed an interesting fact. More than 60% of the viewers of our videos are not subscribed to the channel. 60%, that's considerable. It's still quite a significant number, so I'm allowing myself to call on you. If you like our work and wish to support us, consider subscribing now. In return, I commit to taking your feedback into account, inviting the best international specialists, and continuing to create a high-quality program. I'm counting on you. Thank you very much. He analyzes our world with the gaze of a doctor faced with an exhausted patient, and his assessment is clear and precise. We suffer from our incessant desire to always want more. A tenured professor at HEC Montreal, he has been teaching economic sociology as well as the principles of degrowth for several years. Researcher, thinker, and educator, he challenges the beliefs of a system convinced that producing more always means progressing. In his book titled Healing from the Illness of Infinity, he presents an alternative, an approach that questions our way of working, consuming, and managing our time. Bold and stimulating, it challenges our certainties. What if growth no longer necessarily represented the future? And what if true luxury today lay in time, simplicity, and the collective spirit? Eve-Marie Abraham, hello and welcome to Le Manal Show. Hello Manal, thank you for your invitation. I am happy to welcome you to this new episode. As you know, we have prepared many questions. We have about 2 hours to discuss truly fascinating topics. To begin, Eve-Marie, I suggest you dive straight into the heart of the matter. In your opinion, what is the greatest illusion we have been made to believe about progress? There are of course many, so one must make a choice. It is the idea that economic growth and technological progress would be the essential condition for humanity's happiness, both collectively and individually. I think that is the real illusion, a belief that has become widespread, shared by a great many people, and that raises questions today, since we are realizing more and more that this economic growth. It is undoubtedly necessary to clarify what is meant by economic growth. For a given economy, it is the capacity to produce ever more goods and services, in other words, commodities, and to sell ever more of them on the market. This is what is called growth. When, year after year, production is continuously increased, one enters into a dynamic of growth. It is the idea that this growth may not be a sufficient condition for humanity's happiness, but that it would be an essential condition, one that we would need. We would need this growth if we wish to improve the human condition. Furthermore, beyond economic growth, there is also the idea that technical progress would be an essential condition for improving our lives, both individually and collectively. It is precisely this conviction that I fundamentally challenge. When we examine what I call the race for growth, we find that it is a dynamic in which we are all involved. When we take stock of this race, we find that it is almost always the same people who come out as winners and the same ones who bear the losses. From the very start, one can draw a fairly accurate picture of the winner and the loser. The winner generally corresponds to a person similar to me, that is, an elderly man living in an affluent neighborhood of a large city in a developed country. The loser is most often a woman, rather young, from a disadvantaged background. For example, a resident of a precarious neighborhood near Bujumbura, the economic capital of Burundi, a country that today ranks among the poorest in the world. Thus, when one tries to draw a typical portrait, this is indeed the result obtained. To follow up on what you just said, who would have an interest in keeping the situation as it is, and especially not changing it? In this quest for growth, the determining factor of success and victory lies in the mastery of capital. Thus, those who hold mastery of capital and control of the means of production are, in general, the true winners. These actors obviously have no interest in questioning this dynamic, since they are clearly its main beneficiaries. Indeed, it is a kind of race that recalls the ceaseless motion of a hamster wheel. You know, those wheels in which the hamster seems trapped, running endlessly without any real destination, simply to keep the wheel turning. It is, in a way, the situation in which we all find ourselves. But here, even those who hold the highest positions in the social hierarchy find themselves running tirelessly, for they must keep up this pace to maintain their place at the top. If they stop running, they risk losing their position and ending up at the bottom of the social ladder. Thus, nowadays, everyone somehow finds themselves serving this dynamic of growth. This growth is normally supposed to be beneficial to us. It should represent a factor of improvement in our lives. But it is clearly noticeable and constantly heard that we need more growth and stability. Thus, it ends up becoming the main objective rather than a simple means, and turns into an end in itself. In my view, and in ours, this is the third reason to question the promise of improving our living conditions. So, Eve-Marie, what isn't working in our society and is leading us straight to a dead end? It's the fact that today we are indeed trapped in this constant pursuit of growth, and also dependent on this continuous quest for technological power. We are truly caught up in this dynamic, with the feeling that we must constantly move forward at full speed. The image that comes to my mind is that of a person running on a treadmill in a gym. They run not to move forward somewhere, but simply to stay upright, to avoid the fall that the machine would cause if they stopped running. This is precisely the situation in which we find ourselves today. In other words, whether we like it or not, even when we realize that this race for growth is leading us straight into a dead end, whatever image we choose, we have no choice but to keep running. I myself am forced to run, and we are all caught up in this same dynamic. If we wish to ensure the stability of our personal lives, but also that of our societies, then our political leaders, when they claim that growth is necessary, are not entirely wrong. In other words, growth is the essential condition for society to hold together. It allows people to have jobs, to meet their needs, and enables the state to see its financial resources increase. In short, growth is also what generates the tax revenues that feed the state budget, thereby enabling it to fund public services such as healthcare and many other benefits. Thus, we are indeed caught up in this pursuit of growth which, while supporting our way of life, paradoxically ends up weakening our living conditions and involving certain forms of exploitation, sometimes marked by strong intensity. We have not mentioned a third type of exploitative relationship, namely that of the northern countries toward the southern countries. In other words, these are neo-colonial relationships that still lie at the heart of current relations. It is impossible to understand the current prosperity of Western countries without taking into account the exploitative relationships that persist between the North and the South. It is an essential element, and all of this endures. Moreover, we are becoming increasingly aware of it. We feel that our lives lack meaning, as they seem reduced to an endless pursuit of growth. And despite everything, we continue down this path, because we are trapped in it. In reality, this is what allows a certain stability to be maintained in our lives. Professor Ismari, could you tell us what was for you the key moment, the moment when you realized that something was not working properly in the way our society functions? It would be difficult to identify a specific moment. There are undoubtedly several moments in a life that have led me to reflect on these questions. Perhaps the moment when I left the isolated island where I lived with my parents during my childhood, to discover the outside world with its harshness and brutality.
In what place did you live?
On which island exactly? I spent the first years of my life on one of the Glennon Islands, located off the coast of Brittany, in France. A splendid island? Yes, absolutely, on the island of Pinfred, which was practically uninhabited. It was therefore a rather dreamlike existence, but also a somewhat artificial one, because we still depended on the industrial world that ensured our livelihood. So we should not overly idealize the conditions in which we lived. But that undoubtedly represented a first shock. There was undoubtedly another shock: the discovery, through reading anthropological or ethnological texts and accounts, of human societies functioning according to very different principles, populated by individuals who, ultimately, did not seem so unhappy. Thus, I discovered the real possibility of a totally different world, and not necessarily a frightening one. On the contrary, a universe in which I might not be able to live, for the societies I am thinking of are often what are called hunter-gatherer societies, worlds that are both harsh and profoundly unique. There is no human world devoid of madness, but ours lies in having made growth a kind of main political goal. But precisely, certain societies pursue entirely different goals, that of living peacefully and devoting a large part of the day to talking, playing, or resting. It is a particularly interesting perspective, especially when compared to our current ways of living. Could you explain to us what you mean by the expression, the sickness of infinity? It is about this relentless quest for growth and technological power, fueled by the deep conviction that our desires and needs are limitless and must constantly be fulfilled. That's what makes it troubling. Why do we speak of an evil? Because if our desires have no limits, nothing will ever truly satisfy us. Thus, we find ourselves caught in a kind of paradox. Indeed, we live within what are described as societies of abundance. Never before has humanity produced so many goods and services for its own use. Yet it remains in a constant state of feeling deprived. However, if we admit that our desires are without limits, as assumed by the postulate of economic science, this discipline, today particularly influential among the social sciences, is based on that same fundamental postulate. Human beings have unlimited desires, which naturally gives rise to a situation of scarcity. The proposed response to try to overcome this problem of scarcity is to continuously increase production. It is precisely this assumption that Marshall Solons challenges, asserting that it does not correspond to reality. Some human beings do not have endless desires. However, when one believes they are limitless in nature, the quest never ends. We somehow impose on ourselves an experience of constant lack, and that is precisely what we feel. Over time, this intensity tends to fade, but it remains present nonetheless. As long as we remain trapped in this logic, we stay subject to a kind of scarcity, for desires always exceed the means we have to satisfy them. Wouldn't that precisely be part of our human nature, to feel boundless desires and never reach complete satisfaction? This represents an essential aspect of the debate. It is precisely on this point that anthropologists and even historians have enlightened me, for they describe societies and human beings who do not seem driven by these limitless desires. But for what exact reason? There is a multitude of possible debates and discussions, sometimes more nuanced and more oriented toward a scientific approach. However, it seems to me that there are already many elements, both in this story and all around us, that point in this direction. We also observe people who do not always seem to be guided by this relentless pursuit of accumulation or endless progress. We have ample evidence suggesting that this tendency does not truly stem from our nature, but rather results from conditioning, an idea passed on, cultivated, and taught, which then drives us to endlessly pursue the desire for more. So, could this notion of boundless desire actually have been shaped by the society in which we live? Ultimately, many factors have contributed to this state of affairs. The idea of progress, for example, is closely associated with the belief that our desires would have no limits. In other words, it is the belief that we could continually improve things, a relatively recent concept in the history of humanity. This idea began to take shape in the West toward the end of the Middle Ages. It is at that moment that, gradually, people begin to think, from now on, we are going to take part in a dynamic of progress. If one looks for its origins, Christianity shows certain connections with the idea of a possible improvement in the human condition. Thus, this perspective supports and nurtures this quest. We must move forward, in fact, whereas in many other human societies, progress was not the main goal. The goal was rather to live according to the teachings passed down by the elders, considering that these ways of life were generally satisfactory, and that, ultimately, our earthly destination corresponded to the completion of a cycle meant to come to a close. Thus, in this context, one feels neither anxiety nor that pressing need to always want to move forward and make progress. In reality, once one is convinced of the necessity of progress, a dilemma arises. We will end our existence with a feeling of incompletion and dissatisfaction. The end of life interrupts me on a path that, in reality, will never know its completion. A deep anxiety appears, accompanied by a loss of meaning in life that follows from it. If we consider life as a kind of cycle to go through, this anxiety undoubtedly comes from human beings who feared the end of life, but gave it a meaning quite different from ours. For us, the end of life interrupts this ongoing quest to satisfy ever unmet needs and to improve means that are never considered sufficiently optimized. This contributes to a profound loss of meaning in existence. Do you think there is a link or a correlation between spirituality and this idea of growth, this constant desire to always go further? I feel that our present world tends to move somewhat away from its religious and spiritual values. People are seeking that today. Do you think there could be a connection with this quest? It is that form of quest you mentioned, perceptible among many contemporaries. Today, in my opinion, it is a way to compensate for this loss of meaning linked to the idea of endless progress, which makes accepting the conclusion of life difficult and devoid of meaning. Hence the multitude of efforts undertaken to try to recover a sense of meaning, despite everything. That would be a first element of response to your question. Next, when one examines the very origin of this notion of progress, and thus of perfectibility, it is true that this idea of perfectibility was initially conceived on moral and spiritual levels, but it is likely that Christianity had a significant influence on the emergence of this worldview, which is called the myth or ideology of progress. I think there are fairly close connections on the intellectual level. And finally, haven't we now entered into this? Have we ultimately replaced the search for meaning with an essentially material quest? Yes, exactly, while asserting that we live in secular societies freed from deities. Some persist, of course, but rather on the periphery. In short, we have turned the page on the sacred and the religious. It is the belief in which we were raised, at least in the West, until quite recently. In reality, we have simply created new forms of the sacred. Another form of the sacred resides precisely in economic activity, which represents the sacred specific to modernity. And we also maintain a completely irrational connection with this sacred, that is to say, it is not based on any rational logic. We are told that this is far more rational than the worship once offered to a transcendent deity or to the sun.
In my view, this follows the same logic. It is just as fetishistic as the beliefs that modern people have often judged condescendingly, saying, "Look at those peoples who worship statues or objects."
We devote genuine admiration to economic activity, banknotes, and all of these symbols. There is a deeply fetishistic relationship toward the economy. I suggest we continue with a theme that I find particularly fascinating, that of work, and more specifically, work that lacks usefulness. Eve-Marie, for what reason does growth generate so many jobs lacking real usefulness? What is meant today by the term useless jobs? And ultimately, what exactly do we mean by growth? As I mentioned earlier, it is about producing and marketing ever more goods and services that have monetary value. That is the classic definition of the concept. Thus, growth ends up becoming a mechanism where production happens simply for the sake of producing, a self-perpetuating logic of production. And at this stage, we can already glimpse the beginnings of an answer to your question. Why do jobs lacking usefulness exist? Because it is necessary to produce. Consequently, all kinds of approaches are implemented whose only justification is to maintain or encourage this dynamic of production. This therefore leads me to adopt a rather critical stance toward the concept of a useless job, introduced by my colleague Greber, whose idea has met with great success. What is particularly interesting about this notion is the extent of its success. Moreover, Greber discusses it in his book. He explains that one day he was asked to write a short, deliberately provocative article. He then mentions his idea of useless jobs, which he presents in a very concise article. This article subsequently generated considerable enthusiasm. This sparked exceptional enthusiasm, as many people realized that their jobs seemed meaningless to them. My work makes no sense, I don't like it, and I feel useless, and so on. Thus, this above all reveals that many people today are deeply convinced of it. In my view, and no doubt rightly so, we are gradually realizing that this growth logic is based on a productivist vision where the main thing is to produce. The aim is not to do good or to be useful, but simply to produce. There inevitably comes a time when we realize that our work, even among the noblest and most rewarding such as that of a teacher, can provoke this reflection. I am a university teacher, a remarkable profession. However, today it is partly subject to a production-oriented logic. In reality, we are constantly urged to increase production, to welcome more students, to publish ever more, to the point of sometimes forgetting the deeper meaning of this activity. Would you have specific examples of professions whose real usefulness can be called into question? I don't believe we can assert today that there are professions lacking usefulness. They serve a role within this growth-oriented logic. On the other hand, people working in these professions often feel a lack of usefulness, as it is hardly motivating to feel reduced to a mere tool of this production logic. Thus, I would not say that, in the world as it is today, certain activities are devoid of usefulness. On the other hand, in a world that pursued goals other than mere growth, it is certain that many professions would then lose all their meaning. Which ones exactly? Do you have a few examples to share? Listen, it is clear that all the professions whose main objective is to encourage us to consume would be concerned, because growth, as I mentioned earlier, involves not only producing but also marketing. For there to be growth, it is necessary that products be sold. Therefore, we need people capable of persuading us to buy them. Our consumption today is the main driver of growth. So this concerns professionals in advertising, communication, and marketing? Absolutely. In such a world, it is clear that these activities would very likely disappear in a post-growth society. I imagine that a large part of financial activities would also lose their importance. I mentioned earlier our notion of the sacred. Our sacred domain today is the economy, and finance, within it, perhaps represents the most sacred expression of that sacredness. In short, it is in this field that the highest salaries and the most significant benefits are found. However, in a post-growth society, where the goal would no longer be to constantly accumulate more capital, since it is precisely this accumulation that constitutes the very reason for growth, these professions would quite naturally disappear. Whereas today, they occupy almost a dominant position on a global scale. At HEC, it is well known that students specializing in finance are the ones who receive the highest salaries upon graduating. It is clear that these people would no longer receive the highest salaries and that their activity would simply end up disappearing. And precisely, in your opinion, what does truly useful work mean? How would you define a harmonious and virtuous society? How can one define a fulfilling and balanced life? If a successful life is defined by growth, any job that contributes to that progress, particularly one that promotes the accumulation of financial resources, will be seen as useful and well-paid. This is exactly the situation in which we find ourselves today. If we set as our collective goal the creation of a society based on balanced relationships among people and with nature, then all activities that promote this harmony will be regarded as valuable and truly useful. It is already a reality, as we have observed, through the reflection that emerged during the periods of lockdown amid the pandemic, when everyone questioned what we truly need. In the current situation, it is essential to value the support and caregiving work mentioned earlier. People who care for those in difficulty, capable of accompanying them, nurturing them, and helping them regain their balance. This is an indispensable foundation. So health professionals and stakeholders in the agricultural sector? Exactly. And the bakers? All these essential activities that meet the fundamental needs of humanity should be recognized as truly useful works, professions, and occupations. And regarding the field of entertainment, what is your opinion on this subject? Thank you. That's an essential question, because people often tell me, degrowth ultimately means restricting ourselves and reducing our needs only to food, housing, clothing, and, moreover, all wearing the same things. Extremely basic, really very elementary. Some interpretations of degrowth take on a very moralizing tone, even imbued with religious rigor, which does not at all correspond to the vision of degrowth that I support. In my view, degrowth should instead represent a true liberation, a deeply joyful experience in the face of this frenzied race in which we are caught up. And that involves celebration. The party is absolutely essential, but the genuine one, the one that has meaning. Nowadays, the celebration has turned into a commercial product and mere entertainment. It has therefore largely lost its true essence, as it now mainly serves to generate profits. In reality, this brings us back to the concept of the bullshit dome and to your initial question, namely why. Yes, indeed, when a concert ticket reaches the price of 1,000 euros, it seems to me that there is a real problem. Today, almost all our activities are governed by the obligation to generate profits and increase the value of capital. Thus, that is where the true meaning lies. This ends up altering the essence of all our activities, even the noblest and most essential ones, like those we have just mentioned, as they become dominated by the omnipresent demand for profitability. Contrary to Greber's claim, some jobs are truly demeaning, while others are not. I think that, in our present society, most jobs, whatever they may be, end up losing their meaning because they are all dictated by the logic of profitability. Hence the need to free oneself from it. My perspective is sharper than Greber's, who seems to suggest that on one side there would remain pleasant jobs and on the other unpleasant ones. No, all professions are affected by this phenomenon, including those in entertainment and the arts. Today, when you interact or collaborate with artists, you notice that they too face this same demand. And this ends up altering their artistic approach, yet they have their own message and expression to convey. But deep down, all of this is dominated by the pressure to generate income and, even more, to let someone else benefit from it. Thus, everything tends to become a commodity, a situation from which it is necessary to free oneself. For my part, it is of course not a matter of giving up art or celebration, but rather of preserving the spirit of true festivities. On the other hand, it is a matter of highlighting much simpler aspects, essential and authentic elements. Perhaps instead of simply listening to music purchased online or at concerts, it would be enriching to play it yourself and even to create it collectively with others. It may not be as spectacular, nor as refined or elegant, but we will accomplish it all the same. For me, one of the main ideas of a year focused on growth is to commit to a form of self-production and self-consumption, creating by oneself, for oneself, consuming what one produces and producing what one consumes. That nevertheless constitutes one of the fundamental principles of post-growth as I conceive it. I therefore retain two essential points. Degrowth does not mean a monotonous existence, which is excellent news, especially for those of us who enjoy the pleasures of life. The second point is that there are not only two types of jobs, useful occupations and those that would not be. You claim that, in any case, our professions always involve a certain degree of superficiality. Absolutely. Even the most noble trades, including artisanal professions such as that of a baker, are nowadays influenced by a logic of profitability. He will no doubt be guided by the desire to produce quality bread. It is the typical example of a craftsman concerned with work well done. However, in today's world, unfortunately, that is not what predominates. What matters most is no longer the quality of the work accomplished, but the ability to generate income. There can sometimes be harmony between the two aspects, but most often they turn out to be rather opposed. Thus, to continue practicing his trade as a baker, he will probably be led to make compromises on his standard of quality. No, I am going to make a bread that I consider to be of lesser quality, but it's the one that sells best, the one that will allow me to keep my business running and meet my financial obligations, etc. Thus, the banker in a way becomes the final arbiter, It is he who determines whether or not your business generates profits. So this is the rule to which we are all subject. For me, degrowth represents above all an attempt to break free from this norm. That's enough. We are all influenced by this model. It's time to set other goals and develop new projects, both collective and individual. To expand on what you're mentioning, how can we explain that professions essential to the proper functioning of society, such as nurses, bakers, or farmers, are paid far less than traders or professional athletes, whose social usefulness seems lesser? An answer may seem a bit simplistic, but one could say that these professions simply offer fewer opportunities to grow capital. Then there are professions that facilitate the appreciation and accumulation of capital with ease. And then, there are professions that are perceived differently, particularly those related to care and support. In other words, practicing a care profession does not directly generate profits. Indeed, these occupations tend to be less valued economically, even though their great social usefulness is widely recognized. We will probably not devote any investment to it. I would say that, to a large extent, that is what explains this kind of discrepancy. No experience in finance or specific degree is required. You simply need a deposit of 1,200 RM to activate your account. This system is designed to realistically generate between 140,000 and 230,000 renminbi during the first month, which represents a daily income of about 5,500 renminbi. It's the financial freedom you've been waiting for. Your investment is secure, as this project is officially approved and supported by Maybank. I am fully convinced of the effectiveness of this system, to the point of offering a personal guarantee. If your income does not reach at least 115,000 ringgit during your first 30 days, a compensation of 230,000 ringgit will be paid. Seats are limited and will close this week. Click on the link below, complete the form, and wait for your manager's call. Watch another video. Thank you for watching this sequence. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you sincerely for watching this video. Your time and attention are greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your interest and support are greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching this video. We sincerely appreciate your attention. A big thank you for watching this video. Your interest and support are deeply appreciated. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you very much for watching this video. Your attention and interest are greatly appreciated. A big thank you for watching this video. Your time and interest are greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching this video. Your support and attention are sincerely appreciated. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your interest and support are truly appreciated. A big thank you for watching this video. Your attention and interest are greatly appreciated. Very well. Eve Marie, I'm going to invite you to take part in a small exercise. Could you give us a list of professions that are likely to disappear completely in the coming years? I would say that today, my students, I am convinced that you do not choose to engage in activities that can be easily replaced by machines. There are therefore a large number of collective activities, especially with the recent rise of artificial intelligence, that can now be carried out by machines. It can be seen that in highly creative sectors, some people are currently seeing their profession change or disappear in the field of media. Jobs related to attractions are not particularly creative. Even screenwriting professions are undergoing significant changes today due to technical advances in their field. I imagine that in the field of journalism, we also see changes in this profession, which remains a very beautiful and very important professional field. It's a profession that is likely to be gradually transformed, I imagine, by technological advances. I would say that certain so-called first-level intellectual activities will probably be automated or handled by machines. Yes, you are right. Tools like ChatGPT have already transformed the work of many journalists. Yes, exactly. These are occupations that can be automated or outsourced, carried out by other equally skilled professionals elsewhere in the world, but at a much lower cost. That is mainly what is at stake for me today. So, what do we really have left? In which professions should one commit or invest one's efforts? Precisely. There is a remarkable book that perfectly matches the spirit of your shows and podcasts. It is The Praise of the Carburetor by Matthew Crawford, a renowned philosopher. After his studies in philosophy, he realizes that he does not truly find meaning in what he does, that he risks spending his life writing almost useless reports that are rarely read, a typical example of those jobs lacking genuine usefulness that Greber talks about. Also passionate about motorcycles, he eventually changes direction and becomes a mechanic specializing in this field. He then explains that a mechanic, a person capable of repairing machines, is truly essential and that his work cannot be outsourced, since repairs must be done where the machines are located. That is an essential activity. It is well known that today, a plumber is someone whose trade ensures a good quality of life, since their work cannot be outsourced or replaced by a machine. Mechanical work is a particularly demanding activity, full of unforeseen events and impossible to fully automate. Human intelligence plays an essential role in it. All occupations where this form of intelligence will remain essential, as well as those that combine intellectual work, even when it involves a manual trade, with an activity that also engages the body. In reality, it is the professions that combine these two aspects. By observing carefully, we can see that for 2 centuries our civilization has established a kind of distinction between intellectual and manual occupations. And, in reality, both types of occupations have undergone a certain devaluation. Both categories of occupations have lost value. Manual work, in particular, has been considerably depreciated. It recalls Chaplin in modern times, where the worker is portrayed as a person reduced to tightening bolts. It is truly the most extreme form of devaluation of manual labor. Artisans have been deprived of their know-how, while the production of what they once made has been mechanized. However, intellectual work is currently undergoing a similar process and is also gradually tending to be replaced by machines. In reality, it is essential to focus on what the machine is incapable of accomplishing. In reality, it is a matter of combining the 2 dimensions, intellectual work and manual work. It is often an activity with a strong intellectual component. Designing an object is already a complex task, but repairing it is even more so. That's why I would lean toward this approach. It is clearly another essential activity that cannot be relocated. It is about taking care of people, in other words, providing them with attention and assistance, supporting them as they eat, take care of their health, grow, and learn. I think there remains here an essential element, something that endures. Up to a certain point, because I think artificial intelligence is already starting to establish itself in the medical field. Yes, it's also a real revolution within our universities. We talk about it almost daily at the moment, because part of the knowledge that we use to convey in our classes is now accessible within seconds on this type of website. And some teachers are deeply unsettled by this situation. Absolutely. For my part, I hope that with this technology, the adverse effects will become so significant and so visible that it will end up causing its own rejection. That is exactly what is happening. We are developing, for example, classes and courses without technologies because we find that the side effects associated with their use are becoming truly too problematic. Thus, we are gradually moving away from these technologies. We are reintroducing, for example, oral exams where direct interaction between people regains all its importance. It is an interaction between 2 people who exchange directly, using a very simple method, that of human communication, which you and I are practicing right now. You and I have learned to speak, to exchange. It's a kind of technique, nothing purely instinctive. There would certainly be other ways to communicate. Returning to such extremely simple practices ultimately tends to lessen the importance of high technology. It may be a bit too optimistic to believe that we will manage to make it secondary, but I think it is one of the major challenges of our time. And how is it going with the students? Is everything going well? Do they easily accept this principle? I imagine that nowadays it's not easy to offer this type of course to the younger generation. In reality, no, because this generation, which is probably also partly yours, has already been widely exposed to these technologies, particularly to the use of the smartphone. And in reality, she clearly perceives the negative effects of these devices and acknowledges their potentially alienating nature. She observes how these devices, originally designed to assist us, now seem to exert a form of control, constantly demanding our attention to the point where we find ourselves serving them rather than mastering them. It's interesting, because I've been offering sessions of critical reflection on our technologies for a little over 10 years. And 10 years ago, when I expressed criticisms about the smartphone, my remarks did not meet with much response. Today, it has become clear. The majority of my students acknowledge that this tool is essential. Now, the real challenge lies in the fact that our way of life is structured in such a way that it is almost impossible to do without a phone. We can no longer do without it. However, what constitutes a real problem is the paradox created in relation to the technology's original promise. The promise of technology is to increase our freedom. However, some innovations have become so integrated into our daily lives that they restrict a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to choose not to use them, which is now almost impossible. It is one of the great paradoxes of this situation, and it is precisely through this aspect that I approach my critical reflection on technology. One moment, have you noticed that? In reality, you adapt to the imposed parameters. Do not think you have full control, for you must use them in order to progress in this world. Students are becoming increasingly aware of this, and it often leads them to share this critical reflection, notably that of the philosopher Gunther Anders, who in 1956 published a work entitled The Obsolescence of Man. He offered a critical analysis of technology, emphasizing that, little by little, this technical progress would profoundly transform our relationship with the world. This process gradually helps to reduce a part of our humanity, transforming us into elements of a vast technological system that is tending to become increasingly unified. In the end, it is a discourse that meets with a certain success, at least among my students, who have a rather unique approach. This is not a topic on which I need to argue at length. It seems quite obvious. In my view, this phenomenon affects the female students of this generation more strongly, those who have grown up and interacted intensively with these technologies, than people of my generation, who are often still torn between fascination and apprehension. Really? I see. All right, though I thought it was actually the opposite. I believe you have reached a level of maturity greater than ours regarding the question of. You place me in the frame, but you know that I am fully aware of my age. Oh no. Honestly, I believe you are probably much younger than I am, but your generation has a more developed maturity when it comes to all these technologies and tools, unlike mine, which was rather taken by surprise by their arrival. Our advantage, as I often tell my students, is that I knew a world where the internet did not exist. I know that it is quite possible to live without the internet and to be happy without using it, which remains very difficult for today's young people. That is our strength. But as for me, I'm not very skilled when it comes to mastering these technologies. In the end, I remain a little less comfortable than my students. So, Eve-Marie, you claim that technological progress is gradually leading to the disappearance of part of what defines humanity. With artificial intelligence, we are seeing, I would say, its realization. Many activities that once seemed profoundly human to us are now carried out by machines, which shows that human beings are becoming obsolete in certain areas. And we will be faced with this question: what will we do with people who seem to no longer have a useful role to play? Who appear useless in light of the requirement for capital accumulation, since they generate no economic benefit. So, what we're going to try to do is turn them into consumers, because, as I mentioned earlier, society needs consumers. We will therefore seek to give them the means to consume, which remains essential, but it presents a real challenge. But it is indeed the dynamic that has accompanied us for 2 centuries. Little by little, technical progress takes over human activities that end up losing their meaning as genuinely human activities, since they are no longer carried out by human beings. These are therefore phenomena that appeared with the invention of the first machines. A rather famous revolt took place in England, that of the Luddites. It was led by workers who rose up against machines that not only replaced them, but also damaged the quality of their work. It is therefore a phenomenon that has continued since the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Could we envisage opposition to artificial intelligence? I don't just imagine it, I even hope for it, because it would reflect a collective awakening. I hope this awareness will grow, and that, little by little, we will truly understand the extent of the technical nature of these developments. For artificial intelligence simply represents the most advanced expression of a much broader dynamic. I hope that more and more of us will question this so-called technical progress, which in reality is only progress from a technological standpoint. From a technical standpoint, it is true that we are gaining in power, but from a human perspective, what do we really gain from this progress? In the most unfavorable scenario, it now seems that this contributes to erasing or altering certain human activities that are nevertheless essential. It is what could be described as the art of harnessing artificial intelligence for writing, planning, idea generation, and the accomplishment of concrete tasks. There you go, one experiment per day is enough. This is the 28-day challenge dedicated to artificial intelligence, specially designed for beginners over 40, which is scheduled to launch tomorrow. Touch the stage to join us and discover the unique habit that will make you irresistible. So, you really don't want to use artificial intelligence? Indeed, I think I can state that publicly before you here. Yes, I believe it is truly something very harmful, in fact, deeply damaging. Thus, in the movement to which I belong, we advocate what are called simple or low-tech technologies. These ultimately lead us to reconnect with what can be described as bodily techniques. It is another concept that I particularly appreciate, drawn from the work of the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, the techniques of the body. He explains that, ultimately, our first tool is the body. And that tool doesn't present too many difficulties, because we more or less keep control of it. You just need to feed it, and from an ecological point of view, it doesn't pose any problem. Everyone has one, more or less efficient, but that's still acceptable. And it is from this that we can begin. For example, to illustrate concretely, the topic of transportation is today widely debated in our societies, since it represents a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, one wonders, which solution should be adopted? Electric car, combustion engine vehicle, individual transport, or collective transport? We often forget that we have a mode of travel that presents none of these drawbacks: walking. It's a skill. You learn to walk, I learned to walk, and it's a technique that was taught to us. However, considering the travel that our society demands today, is this still achievable? This is no longer really possible, because our society has largely been structured, in territorial terms, by and for the use of cars. In France, the train still has a certain place, but in North America, it is mainly the car that dominates. Thus, our societies are designed around the car, one could say. In a way, it is the car that sets the rules, becoming the grand architect of our collective organization. But this offers us a line of thought on how to rethink our world, imagining an environment where the walker and walking become the most effective method. It's quite simple. Urban planners go in the same direction as we do by asserting that we must strive to recreate what they call complete living environments. It's not a particularly elegant name. A complete living environment is one where everything needed for a good life is within walking distance. This concept, if one looks at the history of humanity, does not require going very far back in time. It is also called a village, a beautiful village. That's it, a place where one finds almost everything needed to live well. From there, a path begins to emerge. How can we imagine a world after growth? How can we reorganize geographically a world after growth? Seeking to recreate villages or lively neighborhoods within cities that will be smaller than those of today. Here are some directions that provide elements of an answer to the question. But then, if we no longer have these technologies, what can we do? For the internet and communication, we have very simple solutions. Thus, the essential bodily technique consists of engaging in dialogue, mobilizing our bodies to exchange directly through verbal language. This could include sign language, physical contact, or various other modes of communication. Returning to this approach, that is, applied to the field of education, implies a return to the traditional classroom. The classroom also offers a major advantage. It protects people from the bustle and outside noise, which is essential. Today, our classrooms are infused with the internet. The turmoil and bustle of the world enter through it, creating great confusion. Thus, we set that aside, remove those elements from the classroom, and return to direct and authentic communication. If we are to keep the use of paper and pencil, these old and well-tested methods remain effective techniques that have more than proven their worth. If one truly wishes to pass on knowledge over the long term, the book remains a precious resource, old yet essential, both effective and captivating. So yes, I believe that, deep down, it is possible to do without these methods, and that it will be necessary to do so to some extent. To return to the concept of work without real usefulness, I would like to understand why so many people feel they are doing an activity that seems to have little meaning, while continuing nonetheless. Concerning the feeling of uselessness, this is the reason I mentioned earlier. It comes from the fact that we live in a society focused on productivity. We produce simply for the sake of producing, which is not particularly motivating. I create just to create, only because it seems necessary. Why do I keep going? Quite simply because one has to meet their needs. In our society, to live, it is necessary to put one's ability to work at the service of the economy. So, are they mainly economic reasons? Essentially, yes. In any case, the necessary condition for living in our societies is to have an income. And for most of us, the way to achieve it is to make the most of our skills and our labor power in the job market. Thus, for a person who owns means of production and wishes to make them profitable, they therefore seek to generate income through those means. No matter the nature of what he produces, what matters most to him is generating profits. Then he employs people in order to grow this capital. As for us, we are, in a way, compelled to take part in this system. In other words, we are obliged, whatever our opinion may be, to take part in this operation. If we end up without income, we depend on social assistance, which is not a very encouraging situation. Thus, we are truly caught in this mechanism. But then, what is the main danger, exactly, for human beings if they continue to take part in this system? In my view, the dangers are already present. That is exactly what you highlight in your excellent questions. This involves a kind of loss of energy or motivation. What's the point of it all? In practice, it can lead to deep demotivation or a state of discouragement. Observe the amount of. For me, that's exactly one of the signs of the problem, this kind of loss of energy you're talking about. The number of cases of burnout and depressive disorders represents a true crisis in our societies. It is the body that expresses that it can no longer go on, that it is exhausted from pursuing something emptied of meaning and increasingly tiring. Thus, we have a particularly revealing sign. Then, one can ask the question during a meeting. I sometimes do this in my lectures. How many people wake up in the morning already eagerly thinking about the end of the day? It is nevertheless unfortunate to observe that a large part of humanity is mainly waiting for the end of the workday, the weekend, or the holidays. Yet, a fulfilling life would be one in which we wake up each morning with a sincere desire to accomplish what we have to do. Today, a large majority of people certainly do not tell themselves that when leaving for work in the morning. It is the privilege of a small elite or of those who are passionate enough to devote themselves entirely to their work, like me. However, it reveals a real problem. The first problem is therefore already present. Then naturally comes the ecological question, which we discussed a little too briefly earlier. This constant quest for growth leads, on the ecological level, to a rapid deterioration of the conditions that make the planet habitable. In other words, we are gradually creating a world that is becoming less and less pleasant to live in a very concrete and material way. This risk is particularly significant. The other risk clearly concerns possible social imbalances, as such a situation cannot last indefinitely. We can clearly see a rising anger. How do you perceive the situation now? What concrete events might result from it? In my view, the main danger lies in the current rise of radical political movements, a development that I can partly understand, as it reflects a certain weariness with this model. For me, it is another telling sign. We have mentioned depressions, but the act of supporting populist political figures above all reveals a certain weariness. There are dysfunctions within our societies. On the other hand, the option of authoritarian governments with a radical tendency does not, in my view, represent a real solution in any way.
Does the loss of bearings contribute to the rise of radical movements? I am convinced of it, absolutely certain.
I haven't conducted an in-depth analysis, so it would be necessary to question my conviction and examine the situation in more detail. Yes, I think all of this constitutes telltale signs whose most imminent danger, aside from ecological issues, truly lies there. It is this authoritarian tendency, also marked by a closing off to others, that is manifesting strongly almost everywhere. The situation is similar in Quebec. Certainly, we do not have a political figure comparable to Trump, but we are observing a rather rigid right wing, showing more and more signs of withdrawal into itself. And yet, this is precisely the moment when we should show greater solidarity toward a part of humanity whose living conditions are likely to deteriorate much more rapidly than ours in the northern regions. Here is, in summary, the main problems that I identify. In my view, degrowth represents a way of saying, let's take a moment to reflect. There may be another path than that of choosing leaders like Bardella or Trump. It might be possible to. We are indeed a minority, even a small one, but it seems to me that this proposal remains in line with the ideals we are supposed to uphold. In any case, it is a particularly fascinating topic that we will be able to explore further in a future episode. You know that our time is limited. To continue on the topic of work, do you think, Eve Marie, that our society gives too much importance to work? Well, at first glance, yes, I think it would really be desirable to lead a life that allows us to slow down a bit. It's certain, I believe it's truly fundamental. However, I point out that a post-growth world, freed from the constant obligation to chase after ever more, would still be a world where it would be necessary to work hard. Notably because the machines will need to be replaced. So, if we wish to do without them, what solutions do we have? We have our bodies, wonderful instruments, but effort will be required. Thus, I absolutely do not seek to present post-growth as a world where one could spend half the day sleeping. That is not my view. On the other hand, what we will do is work to meet our essential needs. Instead of producing or co-producing goods intended to enrich someone, we will devote our efforts to feeding ourselves, taking care of ourselves, learning, and entertaining ourselves, among other things. And that will require work. However, in a world where we already feel that we work a lot, do you think we are ready to do even more? That's why I preferred to avoid your question about quantity, because for me, that's not really where the problem lies. The real problem lies rather in the purpose. This brings us back to your essential question, why this loss of meaning in all of this? Why these jobs devoid of genuine value? Because, precisely, this work exists and has as its sole purpose to support the system in place and to take part in the accumulation of capital. Then, work became so dominant in our societies that an essential part of our present life is now structured around it. Our identity is built mainly through work. In our societies, when we meet someone for the first time, the natural question that arises is, what do you do in life? Moreover, a person without paid employment or professional activity may feel a certain uneasiness. How many women, even today, without a professional occupation, may feel a certain uneasiness when simply saying, I am a housewife, just like some retirees faced with the same situation. In most known human societies, even in the small villages where I grew up, older people did not ask, what do you do? But rather, who are your parents? Or which village are you from? Thus illustrating a different social organization. Why does our worth seem to depend mainly on what we accomplish? It is industrial civilization and the capitalist system that have made productive work, which generates goods, the core of their organization. In reality, It is this that holds true value, that enables the accumulation of wealth and, consequently, influences the entire system. The social hierarchy is therefore defined by the role each person occupies in the production of goods and in the process of accumulating value. That is what constitutes the determining factor. In a traditional society, the essential element lies rather in the family structure and in the way it is organized. It is family ties that largely shape our identity, while in our current society, it is defined mainly by what we concretely accomplish. But to return to the idea of working more in a society oriented toward degrowth, it is a subject that particularly interests me. Do you sincerely believe that individuals are willing to devote more time to work? Moreover, you're telling me that it isn't necessarily the length of time that matters most, but rather how one makes use of that time. Isn't that right? But do we truly want to devote most of our time to work? I wouldn't put it that way, but I believe that, in part, human beings truly need to stay active. Human beings truly need to be active. Observe, it's interesting, how many people, after a typically tiring day of work, still choose to engage in various activities that are their own and give them genuine personal pleasure. That is precisely what I am talking about. Indeed, we no longer really have time to do things for ourselves. Absolutely. In reality, we carry out these actions for the benefit of capital. To put it frankly, that is indeed what we are doing. Thus, we directly contribute to this process of accumulation. But it is clearly apparent that human beings never tire of engaging in activities for themselves, actions that hold a personal meaning for them. Gunther Anders, whom I mentioned earlier and recommend to your listeners, is a remarkably accessible and captivating philosopher. He explains that in our society, human beings are in fact doubly alienated. The human being is alienated because he creates goods that he does not consume himself, like the worker who produces for others, but also because he consumes objects that he has not made with his own hands. In other words, our existence essentially depends on the consumption of goods and services that we have not created ourselves. And an example that supports her point is what happened during the lockdown. Many people could be seen on social media proudly sharing what they had made themselves. We can therefore sense among people everywhere a genuine desire to take part in the creation of a portion of what they consume. I wouldn't say it's about spending your whole day making bread, because it's a demanding and exhausting job. But to have the ability to create part of one's own food, to develop a portion of one's cultural activities, and more broadly to take part in what one consumes or practices. It should nevertheless be noted that many of these people, for the most part, have turned it into a commercial activity, particularly through social networks. It is therefore a vicious circle. We always end up being caught up, inevitably, by this imperative. In our societies, the main requirement is to generate income. Everything thus ends up being conditioned by this logic. But this highlights that deep within us there exists a genuine desire to contribute, provided it is for our own benefit, that of our loved ones, or a community to which we belong. The essential wager in a post-growth perspective rests on the idea that human beings, when free to decide what they wish to accomplish in life, will naturally engage in work. And that would be essential, because in a post-growth world as I envision it, we would have to give up many machines. Yes, we understood that we had to roll up our sleeves, didn't we? Precisely, when mentioning social networks, Eve-Marie, couldn't we say that they now represent the ideal mechanism sustaining the endless quest? The one that makes us think we are always missing something, even when we already have everything. In any case, I don't know if it's the perfect machine, but it's certain that today it plays an essential role in sustaining this quest for growth, this ongoing and widespread dissatisfaction in which we live, this feeling of lack, whether it's about an object, an event, or a particular access. So yes, there is probably a kind of acceleration in all this, which can today be considered one of the conditions for growth. What are economists trying to observe? They observe the household's state of mind, because for there to be growth, it is essential that they maintain their level of consumption. Everything that promotes this consumption dynamic is fundamental, and it is true that social networks play a particularly significant role in it. In any case, When one observes the importance that advertising holds there, it becomes clear that major issues are involved in supporting consumption. Do you think there are positive aspects to social media? It is certain that I ended up using them, notably because of significant events that occurred in Quebec in 2012, such as a major student movement. Social networks were then an effective way to follow current events, often providing a more precise perspective than that offered by traditional media. So I eventually joined Facebook, and I quickly realized the impressive power that social networks can have. I'm still there, but I admit that I go there less and less, because it's becoming truly intrusive and, in many ways, unsettling. It constantly distracts us from what truly deserves our attention. That's why I'm becoming more and more wary of it. I also notice among my students many initiatives aimed at reducing their use of social media. Indeed, what is at stake here, beyond the encouragement to consume, is this form of capturing attention. Today, this phenomenon is referred to as the attention economy. That is the whole challenge, understanding how to sustainably capture people's attention and divert them from their other activities. It's impressive because this approach proves to be remarkably effective. Thus, the best approach is to detach oneself from it completely rather than trying to make a more appropriate use of it. I have a few friends. In your opinion, would the best solution be to stop using social media completely? Deep down, I believe it's something we should be able to do without. What is essential to us is direct interaction between people, from human to human. On this point as well, there is exciting research that I also present in my courses. Studies reveal the main factors that promote a long and healthy life. Many studies today agree that the most decisive factor is the quality of the relationships we maintain with others. Sometimes the text produced by AI, or even our own writing when we try to adopt a formal tone, can seem rigid or artificial. That's where the humanizer comes in. After you sign up, click on New Document, which will open the Grammarly editor. Here's a very formal sentence. It's a catchy word. Click on the humanizer and watch how it rephrases the entire text. Instead of sounding like a press release, the text appears more friendly and natural, which matches the tone one would want to use when addressing the customers of a pastry company. Relationships that are both diverse and deep. That is what gives true quality. These are people you can trust, whom you can turn to discuss a problem, and whom you can ask for help. It's an essential factor, and there is some truly fascinating research on the subject. In fact, a remarkable TED Talk specifically addresses this theme. It's probably the one that comes to mind and that I share during my meetings. It's the one about the American study on happiness, carried out over many years with very diverse profiles. In the end, the real common thread is human connections. There is also another particularly interesting lecture, whose speaker's name escapes me, but which was about the factors that promote longevity. She specifically drew a comparison between the effects of direct interactions between people on the brain and those of relationships mediated by the internet. She shows that online interactions actually do not have the same effects on the brain at all. It does not activate the same areas of the brain at all, and the beneficial effects of direct interaction are therefore not found in remote exchanges, such as those we have between the two sides of the Atlantic. It does not have at all the same impact on our body as if we were in each other's presence right now. But this means that thousands, or even millions of people, are currently suffering from health problems. In any case, many are at risk of developing disorders, because our interactions are increasingly mediated by technology, which does not provide at all the same benefits as direct exchanges. Thus, in the long term, and particularly after the period of lockdown, one can, in my opinion, expect negative consequences that will become increasingly evident. Unless the human body adapts, which is, moreover, one of its most remarkable qualities, its tremendous capacity for adaptation can be both beneficial and problematic. It would be desirable for the human body to sometimes show more resistance in order to express refusal, but it is true that if this researcher is right, there is cause for concern regarding the growing influence of interactions mediated by technology today. Eve-Marie, do you think that the concept of green business could be considered one of the greatest illusions of the 21st century? The idea that we could preserve the planet while maintaining ever-increasing consumption? The majority of those who support what you call green business, or what is sometimes referred to as green growth or sustainable growth, truly believe in it. It is perhaps often the case. The greatest deceptions or illusions come from those who sincerely believe in them themselves. And it is difficult to prevent those who adhere to the concept of green business from believing in it, since it directly concerns the question of the future. Will we be able to achieve it in the future or not? Today, I prefer to remain cautious. I am not a prophet, but a scientist by training, and like any researcher, I generally refrain from making predictions about the future. What he can understand is the present and the past, but not the future. But do you really think they believe in it? Maybe they have conflicting interests? We could add that idea. Of course, we can add that many people supporting this idea today have every interest in trying to persuade us and in promoting green growth. In other words, the answer we must give them today is that we have never been able to achieve that. It is therefore the starting point, founded on scientific basis, and today we have a large number of studies that demonstrate it. The concept of an ecological business or green growth has no real existence. Truly green growth remains out of reach. That doesn't stop us from thinking that maybe we haven't tried hard enough yet and that we could succeed tomorrow. I deeply doubt it, but as far as the future is concerned, I can oppose them only with my uncertainties. On the other hand, I have certainties about the present. Today, all economic growth inevitably causes negative impacts on the environment. Thus, reviving growth amounts to reviving the processes of environmental degradation. These facts are widely studied and well documented to date. This is the starting point. Then, we can try to understand the reasons why we are not succeeding. At this stage, many constraints arise that hinder the achievement of this much-discussed sustainable growth or green business, and which, in my view, will persist and prevent it from being attained in the future. There are many constraints that should be examined in a more scientific way, which raise serious doubts about our ability to achieve genuine ecological growth, especially within the relatively short time available to us. The environmental situation is currently deteriorating at a relatively rapid pace. Time is running out for us, and it would seem more sensible to think collectively and recognize that we are heading toward a dead end. We should therefore envision a sustainable model of society that is not linked to a continuous deterioration of living conditions on our planet. That, ultimately, is the idea behind alternative growth, to pause and take the time to reflect. Eve-Marie, if we started putting your ideas into practice today, what changes could we observe in a year? You are putting me in the position of a fortune teller, which I can test and refuse. However, if I had to formulate an essential political proposal today, it would be to open a real debate on these issues, to allow an in-depth political discussion of everything we have just discussed over this hour and a half. It would be a matter of establishing a genuine democratic debate, an in-depth discussion on the issue of growth and degrowth. That would already be a significant step, since such a debate does not exist today. I am counting on you to help promote the need for this debate in the future, because, for the moment, it does not yet exist. In reality, it is another critical observation that can be made about our societies. Our societies are governed by the imperative of growth and technological progress, but they are also influenced by political structures whose functioning sometimes lacks genuine democratic character. If we refer to the fundamental definitions of democracy, particularly those formulated by Aristotle, we find that our political institutions more closely resemble forms of elective aristocracy. At the head of our nations are individuals chosen through electoral means, and the election itself constitutes an aristocratic selection mechanism, based on the idea of appointing those deemed the most competent. Thus, it is actually a system that possesses the characteristics of an aristocracy. However, Aristotle had anticipated this phenomenon. He explained that every aristocracy carries a risk, the risk of gradually turning into an oligarchy. In other words, we end up with an elite that wields power, but does so mainly in accordance with its own interests and those of its inner circle. Does that mean that France is not in a fully democratic situation? In reality, Our system more closely resembles a form of oligarchy where power is largely influenced by economic interests. This means that power is exercised by an elite that acts mainly in favor of its own interests as well as those of its social group. Access to political power depends mainly on two factors, namely financial resources and knowledge, which are often closely linked. In 2019, France carried out an interesting experiment, the Citizens' Convention on Climate. This democratic exercise brought together 150 randomly selected citizens tasked with formulating proposals to address the climate crisis. The drawing of lots represents a quintessentially democratic method. When it is necessary to entrust a responsibility to a person, drawing lots is the most consistent and fair method from a democratic point of view. My first proposal would be to set up a mechanism similar to these conventions, but this time endowed with genuine decision-making power. To ensure that the decisions adopted by a randomly selected group are implemented fairly, it would probably be advisable to decentralize them. It is necessary to consider this at the regional level. In my opinion, our states are actually far too large. Thus, it is probably not necessary to completely question the borders of France and other similar boundaries. But, essentially, the political exercise must be considered on a much more local scale. What several of us are proposing today is the concept of bioregions. In other words, the idea of organizing our territories according to their biophysical and natural characteristics, in order to seek a form of harmony between social organization and geographical features. How do we organize ourselves within these bioregions? We aim to ensure that what we need to live is produced and developed at this scale, in other words, at a much more local level, which will naturally reduce access to many external resources. Many things would obviously no longer be accessible. It therefore becomes necessary to transform lifestyles as well as mindsets. We are reorganizing our ways of living on a much more local scale. If one wishes to reduce the use of machines, to simplify my point, and to adopt a more modest approach to technology, regionalization is an effective method because it greatly limits the need to travel. What I mentioned about walking is a good example of this, but it is just as essential that we work together. It is therefore necessary to work together and set up groups dedicated to production. We will not be able to produce everything by ourselves, that is, individually. It is impossible for one person alone to create everything necessary to live fully, which is why collaboration is essential. Thus, to be better organized, we already have several elements that can be utilized. We already have several concrete leads. What tangible changes could we then consider or observe? What we can expect from all this is that, ultimately, our overall level of production will be significantly lower than it is today. Because nowadays, production is often driven solely by the logic of accumulation rather than by genuine needs. Thus, people are encouraged to acquire non-essential goods simply to feed the mechanism of accumulation. In this context, society will turn toward a fundamental reflection. What do I truly need to live well? What is a dignified and balanced life, lived in harmony with my contemporaries? It is quite likely that this will result in a reduction in the level of production. This will also involve, which makes the process more complex, a fair sharing of our resources and our wealth. It is no longer possible to continue like this. At present, a privileged minority tends to concentrate an ever-growing share of wealth without any real limits. It is certain that this represents my second proposal within the framework of a degrowth policy. My first proposal is to reduce our level of production, which will naturally happen if we implement what I am proposing. We will also strengthen sharing, as it is necessary to distribute our wealth much more widely. This could provoke strong reactions, that is undeniable. However, if we try to move forward in a truly democratic way, debating with conviction and accepting disagreements, it is natural for divergent interests to be expressed. But if we fully respect the democratic process, which constitutes my third proposal, namely to decide collectively, then we may hope to make progress along this path. I received an amount exceeding $700, about $500 net. That amounts to about $1,300. Every month, I have the opportunity to generate income using the Sichuan application. You're asking me whether I use the property, Airbnb, crypto app, or another application designed for buying and selling assets. But that's not the case. I only use the Sichuan app. When I first heard about it, my curiosity was piqued.
I heard about it thanks to a man from India, Dr. Kosh, who told me that he was working in Singapore.
He explained to me that he was having difficulties in his work, so he decided to learn a new profession. After a few years, he made the decision to bring his parents and came back from Singapore. At that time, I felt like an engineer. I was working in JB and was considering going to Singapore. It was a difficult time for me. I was shopping and noticed that Dr. Kosh could easily travel to Singapore. I wanted to try the experience. I didn't wish to go to Singapore. I tried for a month, made some purchases, and managed to earn several dozen dollars. At that time, I didn't have the resources needed to cover my expenses, so I decided to focus on my goals, and after a year, I managed to get through it. I know, Professor, that you teach management at HEC Montreal. Your students represent the future leaders and entrepreneurs of tomorrow. I then wondered whether, in a certain way, you were somewhat out of step with the very essence of a business school. Yes, of course, it's an essential question. What is a business school, after all? It's a place where one learns to manage a business effectively. And what is a business? It's a driver of growth. Thus, everything taught in a business school is initially aimed at promoting growth through successful companies. It is therefore clear that with the ideas I am presenting here before you, I am placing myself in opposition to this approach, and there is no doubt about it. But at the same time, couldn't we consider an evolution or a transformation of these business schools? They are still places where one acquires interesting knowledge. Some of my students have, for example, founded a small collective called HEPC, short for Higher Studies of Post-Growth. How can we envision an evolution of our business schools so that they support the transformation of our societies? This is largely how I conceive of my work at HEC Montreal. Moreover, I no longer limit myself to designing a simple course on degrowth. I now develop a full program on this subject. And why do I do it? Because, in fact, a growing number of students are interested in it. I could never have conceived this course, nor written the book you mentioned earlier, without the growing interest of today's young people, including those in business schools, who say they no longer fully subscribe to the dominant model. At that moment, one realizes that something isn't working and begins to search for an alternative. However, we all share certain uncertainties about my colleagues' remarks, I believe. This is becoming increasingly evident. That is what gave me the drive to develop these activities at HEC, a rather unique institution that stands out from traditional business schools in France. In reality, it is a university. This probably has to do with a form of academic freedom that I find perhaps a little more developed than in French business schools, in order to position my institution in relation to others. To connect this with what we mentioned earlier, it seems that the younger generation is showing a return to spiritual and religious values. Is this a phenomenon you observe among your students? Yes, undeniably. Students who take part in this course on degrowth can sometimes feel somewhat disconcerted. For some of them, one of the solutions is to turn to more spiritual forms of activity in order to find answers there. I must admit that it sometimes worries me, because in my view, the answer to the problem I highlight in my critique of growth should be political in nature. In other words, it must concern the way our societies are organized. It is, in my view, at this level that the real solution to these problems lies. Of course, everyone can find personal ways to live better in this society, but in my view, it is neither through personal development nor through adherence to spiritual beliefs that we will manage to transform it profoundly. We can change the way we perceive this society, which will no doubt make it more acceptable in our eyes, and that already represents a significant step forward. It is necessary to discover ways to adapt and live well in today's world. It's really not easy, and it's probably becoming more and more difficult over time. Unfortunately, these solutions do not seem to me capable of truly changing the world, and yet, that is precisely what we need today. It is truly a political action in the noble and profound sense of the term, that is to say, to be interested in the foundations of our society and to seek to make them evolve. And you, who are in contact with the younger generation, I would really like to know what their aspirations and dreams are. What do your students dream about today? I teach in a special program at HEC, which I helped create, dedicated to social innovation. It mainly attracts women and people who want to give real meaning to their work, not to work just for the sake of working or simply to earn money, but to accomplish something useful, necessary, and positive for their environment. They are deeply committed to this search for meaning. But precisely, this concern is not actually something new. But it is true that, in a business school, one often expects to meet students who are mainly motivated by financial success. There are indeed a few of them, but they are not the ones I meet, nor the ones who come to me. And their number keeps increasing. No, clearly, their goal is to contribute to a world that is more environmentally sustainable, more socially equitable, and more democratic. In summary, that's it. It's around these three ideas that I approach them and try to respond to their questions. Thus, it is indeed the main concern of the people I meet, even if they may be. That is precisely where my bias shows, since I spend my days in their company. Thus, it is probably a partial view of today's youth. The people who take part in this program are not chosen at random. Yes, of course I understand. You have acquired a condominium in Kuala Lumpur, and its value has increased. But the value of the ringgit has dropped so much. Do you know that you're losing money? Don't even get me started on the purchase cost. The supply of new condominiums is significant, but what about purchasing power? Not really high, not to mention the completed properties that remain unsold or even abandoned. Thus, even if your property seems excellent, you are only covering the rent, maintenance, and associated expenses. This is the current situation for many Malaysian investors. And you, Eve Marie, what is the luxury you absolutely could not do without? A luxury. And naturally, one expects you to answer honestly. Honestly, I don't know. It's a beautiful question. I really enjoy going to restaurants, but I don't understand why, in a world after growth, there would no longer be any restaurants, I must admit. But it's practically the only luxury I allow myself. Otherwise, I currently wear contact lenses, which are still a rather sophisticated industrial product. It is true that I sometimes tell myself that if I had to put on my large, thick-framed glasses again, it would be difficult, but I would do it nonetheless. There you go, that's part of the thoughts I express to myself. If you could whisper a single sentence into the ear of a 20-year-old eager to succeed in life, what would you tell him? I feel like answering with a touch of humor. Don't pay too much attention to the advice of elders like me. It's a paradoxical remark, but I would say, as I sometimes tell my students, try to do what truly matters to you. I think that's a good foundation. Try to do what you really want, rather than what you believe others think is right for you. That would probably be my main piece of advice. Thank you very much, Eve Marie, for sharing all these values with us. But as you know, it's not quite over yet. We have a little ritual in the Manal show. I like to conclude my interviews with a series of quick questions meant to be answered as spontaneously as possible. It lasts 1 minute 30 seconds. Are you ready? Let's go. Let's give it a try. Here we go. What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? What is the belief you hold that others often see as a somewhat crazy idea? What is the place you like to go to recharge and regain your energy? If you could invite one person to lunch, absolutely anyone, who would you choose? I am not the Premier of Quebec, but I would really like to chat with him for a moment. What was your last somewhat crazy expense? I went to France to visit my mother, then I bought a plane ticket to go to Corsica to see a friend. Here's my latest slightly crazy expense, a friend I met thanks to social media. It just goes to show that online encounters sometimes hold pleasant surprises. What's your hidden talent? To sing. Eve Marie, do you believe in a higher power? No. Who is the person who inspires you the most? James Imprant, a writer opposed to industrialization. What is your greatest fear? Probably suffering, quite simply. And what worries you most about the current world? The spread of extreme ideologies. What bad habit would you like to give up? Spending too much time on social media. And according to your loved ones, what would be your greatest quality? Generosity, sometimes misunderstood, but oh well. And in your opinion, what would be your main flaw? Fear, in reality. What is the last thing you do before going to sleep? I take off my glasses and place them next to me. Thank you very much, Eve Marie, for playing along with the Raffaele questions. It allowed us to learn a little more about you and your personality. I like to conclude with the emblematic question of the Manal show, probably the most essential one of this interview. With time, Eve Marie, what is the lesson that we aren't taught in school? I would say the importance of autonomy. What matters is to become a person as independent as possible. Unfortunately, school tends to create a kind of dependency, as if one continually needed to be guided or trained. I would say that this would be one of my criticisms of the school system. And for me, the essential value of a post-growth world lies in autonomy, both individual and collective. A huge thank you, Eve Marie, for this interview. I found it absolutely fascinating. You know, I still had many other questions that I didn't necessarily have time to ask you, but I think we've already covered a large number of topics. I would like to remind everyone that you are the author of a remarkable work entitled Healing from the Evil of Infinity. Are you currently working on a new book? Yes, I am currently on sabbatical leave, which means that I am not teaching at the moment, in order to write a follow-up that would serve as a response to the main objections I receive regarding degrowth. It is, moreover, one of the elements that helps answer the questions you have raised. Very interesting. Please let us know the publication date so that we can share it with our audience. For those who wish to learn more and gain a deeper understanding of your activities, where can they contact you? Very easily, thanks to that famous machine called the Internet. You will easily find my contact information, including my email address at HEC Montreal, which remains the best way to reach me. Perfect. We will naturally share all the links in the description of this video. Thank you again, Eve Marie Abraham. I wish you much success in all your future projects. Thank you very much, madam, and thank you for giving me your time. Thank you very much. See you soon.